Welcome to Changed My Mind. Over 80% of people think we are becoming more divided. But does it have to be that way? We're bringing together leaders to ask them about a time they changed their mind and why, giving us all an insight into what holds us back and why changing our mind can be such a powerful thing. I'm Alison Goldsworthy, based at Stanford in California and founder of the Depolarization Project. Hosting alongside me today is Laura Osborne, a corporate affairs expert who is fascinated by what impacts reputation and makes it so hard to change our position.
Hi, Ali. I'm really excited to talk to our guest tonight. Not only is he related to one of my favourite people, but he also sings one of my all-time favourite songs. In all seriousness, he's a respected thinker and a real unifier of people who cares very deeply about the issues we will face today and how we might start to navigate them by coming together.
Also hosting today is Alex Chesterfield, a conservative counsellor and behavioural insight expert.
Hi Ali, I'm so excited to be talking to Pete today. My music taste normally is restricted to Kiss FM and Capital FM. So for US listeners, that's R&B and cheesy pop. So I am massively excited to be talking to Pete today.
That's great. And we've had a snippet now of who our guest is, which is Peter Gabriel. Peter is a singer, songwriter, and humanitarian activist. He rose to fame as the lead singer of Genesis before leaving to launch a successful solo career. He co-founded the WOMAD Festival in 1982 and has continued to promote world music through his Real World record label ever since. Peter co-founded the human rights organisation Witness and The Elders. He's been recognised with Grammys, Ivor Novellos, TV Music, and Brit Awards. Pete, thank you very much for coming on to Change Your Mind. We're delighted to have you here.
That's all right. How much am I getting paid?
I think you're getting paid in our kindness and our time. I should probably explain to the listeners that Pete is, in fact, my uncle. So this might be a little bit more, involve a little more repartee.
Irreverent.
Yeah, and irreverence and not the normal degree of deference that we might extend to some of our guests. But I will begin by certainly being deferent, which is clearly you've achieved a huge amount in your life and we're all really proud of you. And I wondered where you've travelled around the world and you've seen...
Stop laughing.
And you've seen people change their minds on issues. Is there anything that's particularly impressed you about that? Or do you observe that maybe our polarisation is getting worse or better as you travel and you speak to people?
If you look at who we're electing, there's no question that we're moving towards the extremes, different, whether it's America, Italy, the Philippines, Venezuela, you're seeing a whole sort of raft of extreme politicians. And I think, one area that perhaps I did change my mind on was I was a passionate supporter of the internet and believe in its ability to liberate us in all sorts of ways. But I think now we are so easily manipulated that I think, I'm much more guarded about my unquestioning support of an unbridled internet. And I think we need to think very carefully. But clearly we are, I think, hot and cold as a species. We have our higher selves and our lower selves. And there's a newspaper maxim, which is, if it bleeds, it leads. And people will be more drawn to watching a car crash than they will to watching the traffic flow by. So that's maybe what I would call our lower nature, that the sort of sex and violence side of us. But it's something that is quite easy to trigger. And I think you have to work with what our human nature is. So I just popped the mic there too. Pops are good. Right. Okay. Sorry. It's singer's reflexes. When you pop, you retake. When things are being wound up, people are being divided, fed fear and hatred, then you're going to get more extreme reactions and more extreme opinions, and you're sort of pushing people down the tunnel of extremist views. I think many of the people who've voted for politicians, for instance, that are cutting support for refugees in the Mediterranean, if they were in a little boat and they saw a child drowning beside them, would pull the child in. And yet they'll vote for someone who will say, let's take that boat out of the sea. This is today's news from the Doctors Without Borders boat. But it's just one example of where maybe the lower nature is being exploited and the higher nature buried. So I think I'm beginning to believe that technology and the internet, which I have praised, loved, and fought for, needs to be thought about a lot more carefully, because it has the opportunity of keeping us in this super stimulated sex and violence mode. If we're looking at all these, the type of programs that Netflix and Amazon are throwing at us now, I mean, they are getting more violent and more sexual. And I think there's a sort of potential for this spiral to move towards more extreme positions in life and in politics and in opinions. And we need to think about that and see, are there any ways we can introduce some blue to chill things down into all this red material that we're being sensitized by or desensitized by.
So I'm sure Alex will have a bunch of suggestions and want to talk to you from a behavioural point on that. But I'd love to just ask, do you find the internet has the same effect on you?
Yeah.
Does it make you more extreme as well?
No, and I think I get angry about some things, and I'll still... There was an interesting experiment when a group of kids were taken into a supermarket and were told they could eat anything they wanted for 2 weeks. And they started off entirely with sort of junk food and chocolate and ended up eating fruit, veg, and brown bread. I may not have it exactly right, but that was the gist of it. So I've always had that hope that we may have a self-righting mechanism internally. However, I'm not sure that I trust it as much as I used to. And I think there are brilliant people out there. And we mentioned Vladislav Surkov. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, but he's Putin's sort of main advisor, and he comes out of the theater, very cultured man, but super smart. And they are, I think, manipulating people deliberately in other countries, sort of on this sort of divide and rule, on this idea that everything is PR and that somehow truth and hard facts are no longer important. It's how you manipulate things. So when, for example, we had the Skripal's poisoning over here, the Russians would, every 2 or 3 days, because they know a story gets cold after 2 or 3 days, they'd seed a new story. And it didn't matter how ridiculous it was. They knew that they could get some attention off one place and move it to another. And I have no idea if this is true, but for example, suppose you want to take Ukraine, but you think you can't do it unless you own a US president, and you want a 10-year plan, then maybe it might be worth getting the votes rigged. I don't know. I have no strong evidence there, but I'm just saying that is a possibility nowadays, that you can rig votes and you can rig people in such a way that they behave. Alex, the behavioral expert. Well, I'm sure she would be able to tell us a lot more about this. But I think, and that in turn brings up a big question, which is, can you trust democracy in quite the same way you used to if we're that easily manipulated? Because we now have way better manipulative tools, with social media, etc.
That's really interesting. I want to actually put an alternative argument towards you, though. So do you think human nature is fundamentally like this? So that we are prone to the darker side of life, so sex and violence, and that actually the internet simply holds a mirror up to this behavior. So it seems more prevalent, but actually it's not. It's just that we've always been like this, and the internet, which shares it and reports it, and that we can see others are doing it, makes us seem that it's more prevalent. So actually, this view that the world is getting worse and that we're becoming more polarized might actually be wrong. So I was interested in your views on that counter argument.
Well, I'm sure sex and violence has, been just as strong in Shakespeare's time as it is now, but I think the tools are different, and the ability to sustain people's stimulation or hyper-stimulated being is easier now. So I would agree that, but it isn't really different fundamentally human nature, but just the ability to play with it and the tools to play with it have changed.
So, yeah, Pete, so we know from many decades of science and evolution that humans are incredibly social, and we are all heavily influenced by what other people do. So I'm interested in this, I guess it's this point about the internet, that actually it's the internet's amplification of what else is going on. So it allows us to see what others are doing that makes it seem potentially more acceptable and more of a norm, which then gives us a license to do the same thing. So what other factors other than the internet and social media might be leading to this increasing polarization that you've observed?
I think that the world is changing faster. In other words, the factor of acceleration seems to have changed. The speed at which transformation has happened. The very fact that almost any individual on the surface of the planet has the potential to contact any other individual on the surface of the planet is a transformational thing in itself. So, plus that we can suddenly have access to information instantly, whereas before it might have taken finding a right person with knowledge or going to a library or whatever to do the research. It was a sort of much slower process. So I do think speed, we're living in a much faster environment, and we have some of these global issues to deal with and live with, whether it's climate change or migration or nuclear bombs, which were around before. But I think the presence of things to be worried about is greater than the things to be cheerful about.
I wanted to jump back slightly to what you were talking about with people being rigged by the internet, and just to push you on this slightly. Yeah. Do you think you've ever been rigged by the internet?
I think I get stimulated, and I find myself doing the list of 10 meaningless things, or I know I can be, but I think I've always known that about myself, that I have. I don't always go for the most nourishing things. For instance, if I've got a long flight, and it's a difference for me with a 2-film flight or a 3-film flight. I tend to go for the first film. I go for the junk food, whatever is getting some noise, and the second film may be a comedy or possibly foreign language thing, and the third film will often be the documentary, from which I get actually the most nourishment, but I will rarely choose it. So I think the internet and me are like that sometimes, that I will know that there's a lot of stuff out there, but I sometimes have to go through my sort of lower self activity before I can release, because in my work mode, I think the two great creative pillars are boredom and fatigue. They make many choices.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially what you're saying about boredom and fatigue, but also the fact that you have to almost go through a sort of journey of relaxation through rubbish in order to prepare, and I think we all have that. Sometimes you can't concentrate because of the noise, so you have to sort of relax yourself before you can listen to something sort of interesting. Do you think when you have conversations about complex issues with people, it's sort of the same, that they're more likely to listen and take in the information if you've started from a kind of much lighter sort of subject matter and then moved into something more controversial?
Well, I love conversations that jump around all over the place, and I think sometimes, I still find that easier to do face to face than on the internet or texting or whatever it is. It's so I don't know if there's a sort of undeclared permission to roam more. It's like when I'm on conference calls, even video conference calls, when I'm still present and everyone can see me, I feel much less able to interrupt when I'm remote than when I'm in a room. And I think that's, so I'm not sure, therefore, if there's an underlying sense of greater freedom and permission when you're in the physical presence of someone than when you're removed through internet or electronics in some form or another.
Yeah, and I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence that people's behaviour face-to-face is very different to online. We're all familiar with plenty of keyboard warriors.
Yeah.
Think about all the Twitter trolling where people, again, have given the license almost by their anonymity and invisibility to behave in ways they would no way behave like in a face-to-face or one-on-one environment. So I think there's definitely truth in that.
But there may be, I think there's a nub of something valuable to this polarization argument, is that, this context for behavior. So I know someone yesterday who cut me off in the car, I would respond really aggressively to, yet I meet the same person, at my front door an hour later, and I'll behave a very different way. I think we need to understand on that scale, where is the internet sitting, and are there things we could do to make people a little more considerate and compassionate, if one accepts that's the goal.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting that Instagram, I think a bit more than Facebook, has got a depolarization unit in-house. And I know they're running some tests, but they're not yet allowed to share what they are. And I find it fascinating that they're going to be looking at imagery and video, obviously, because it's on Instagram, and how that polarizes and they can contribute against that. And I'm looking forward to hearing what they've got to say. They've stolen a bunch of Stanford psychologists to do that. So they are running very large-scale experiments to look at it.
It's interesting, but I had... I was at a X Prize thing this week, and there was Joanna Shields was there, who was, Google and ran Facebook here for a while. And then she was put in charge of sort of cyber security in the UK. And she said they'd come up with a program which they had a lot of evidence for, which showed that they could identify potential terrorists from vocal characteristics that could be monitored. And I think there were some other things, but anyway, it was offered to Facebook and Twitter and was turned down. And she was very disillusioned by that. And I think it's possibly, I asked her a little bit, that if they own responsibility for content, then it puts them in a different legal situation, and they're trying to pretend that they're publish.
Trying to pretend they're not a publisher, and it doesn't
They're
really
not a publisher.
hold water any longer.
Yeah,
and I think it's starting to change.
Yeah, but that's a key difference, because they have permeated extraordinary numbers of people in extraordinary depths. I think the way we interface with the internet, people often say, yeah, Google will know more about me than my partner. It's that data is hugely important, hugely valuable, needs protecting, and that's another issue. But I think we're just like babes entering this new world, and there are, like all babes, we need some protection.
Yeah, and the regulators were very slow to respond. I just want to move into a slightly different area of your life, which is your work with the elders and how they try and bridge divides and resolve problems behind the scenes using their expertise as leaders. I wondered if you were able to share any examples where you felt they'd been particularly effective at depolarizing people to change their mind, and what techniques had they deployed to do that?
Well, quite a few of the elders have been involved in peace negotiations, or Marty Artisari or Desmond Tutu with Truth and Reconciliation. There are people that definitely were Hutus and Tutsis. In fact, the first conversation with Mandela, when Richard Branson and I were trying to sell him this idea of the elders, at Holland Park down the road here, but he said, I don't think those in power will want a bunch of old timers interfering. That was his first reaction. And then he remembered when he was asked to help peace negotiations with Hutus and Tutsis after the terrible genocide in Rwanda. And he'd observed that actually the young leaders, the young generals, seemed to trust him in a way they didn't trust anyone else. And they'd said to him, when we're talking with you, it's like talking to our dad, or who we feel we can trust, has no other agenda other than bringing a peaceful outcome for all those involved here. Everyone else we've been asked to talk with or negotiate with, we feel has a very different agenda. So I think for us, the dream for the elders was that these people who've led extraordinary lives and won a lot of respect around the world no longer have political power, economic power, or military power behind them. They're sailing under moral power. And there's not a lot of that around in the world. So I think the dream was to try and see if they could have a role in conflict resolution in long-term problems, things like the women's rights, or universal health care, as well as specific issues, and problems. So when a group of them under Kofi went to Kenya, I think they did help stop the outbreak of violence. And, they've been to various places that have been ripe with conflict, and calm conversations with people who've sort of been there before and seen similar situations can be helpful, and I think there is a lot in Jimmy Carter told his story to the elders about a time when he was doing the Camp David negotiations with Sadat and Rabin or Begin. I can't remember. I think it was Begin. Anyway, the talks, they worked long and hard, and they'd sort of given up pretty much. And then I'm pretty sure it was Begin came to him just to say goodbye and thank him. And he had a picture of Carter, and he said, "Would you sign this for my grandchildren?" And suddenly there was a moment and they started talking about children and grandchildren, and both started weeping, and they reopened the talks, So it was a very moving thing to hear, but it just gave you this sense of hope that actually sometimes the most intractable, locked-in opponents will, through their own humanity, find ways of listening and accommodating other people. And I think that's what's being lost in this increasingly polarized world.
There's quite a lot of evidence to support both parts of what you're saying, but also that one of the ways to rectify it is that people will have a much better conversation about a difficult issue if they first have a discussion about something that is completely different and where they agree. So the example is with their grandkids and where they bonded over that there, or with other people talking about, I don't know, a sport or a sports team. Like you have people who both support Arsenal, for example, are much less likely to have a very extreme disagreement about whether we should leave the EU or not, because they've got this other thing in common to start with, and how that creates different groups and goes from there.
Sorry, just on that, I was thinking of this guy, Oliviero Toscani, who's a friend, but he's a sort of provocative guy. He's a photographer who was best known for the Benetton campaigns that caused a lot of controversy with death penalty and with AIDS and so on. But he designed a TV program where he'd find opponents. So, for instance, he had a sort of hard right police group with a sort of hard left gay group, and the program was built around a white cube, and I think it was an hour long, but the cube shrunk during the course of the hour, so that these people had to get physically very close to each other. But it was really interesting in the way that distance, physical distance, allowed for a different type of behavior. That once you're sort of crawling over someone, you're going to be forced to behave maybe not positively, but differently by nature of the closeness and the intimacy. So I guess my question is that, like my behavior in the car, the internet supports that long distance, no responsibility, no commitment or compassion for this other person type of behavior. And is there a way of somehow getting a toll of humanness that allows you, that gives you, that opens up your internet access every day, that somehow makes you more vulnerable, but more real and more open to the other person? Now, it's all got to be based on trust. Another example, from the elders, but when Mandela was coming out of 27 years in jail, deciding, what on earth you can do with such a divided, polarized country, his decision was to trust his enemies. And there were people who had murdered his friends, put them in jail, tortured his friends, and he was now talking to them like he would his family or his neighbors, and saying, will you come with me and work in this new world I'm going to try and build, this rainbow coalition? That type of leadership, where can we find that today? Because you think that's got to be what's going to break through this polarized, but it's got to be done in a way where people are sacrificing some of the safety of the distance for the greater good of opening up and, better understanding. Because I think someone described to me the barrier between them and us is how you could tell how civilized someone was. That if you put the barrier of them immediately outside yourself, you knew you were in one place. But if you put your family or your town or your village or your country or the world as us, then you behave differently. So in my mind, we need techniques, a whole array, an army of techniques to move that point at which each of us turn us into them, because that's the crux, the critical point which allows us to behave with hatred.
So, Pete, I want to come back to this point you made about the lack of trust. It's interesting, one of our earlier guests, Jonathan Haidt, the moral psychologist, also mentioned the idea of trust being this master variable, almost like a glue that holds society together. So you're a person of influence, you've got a high profile. Have you seen it become harder for people to trust you or to get people to listen to your views or your experience over the last few years? Has that changed?
Well, I don't know. I think I'm a musician, so I don't know how much people trust musicians. I think, we all have people that we think have lived a bit of life for us, and you live partly vicariously through these other people. But, I met a guy the other day who was trying to turn scientists into rock stars, because we tend, in the old days, maybe we would partly live through royal families around the world. And now it's maybe, TV, film or sports stars or occasional music people. But we're very social, but, we like to think we're creatures of free will, but actually we're enormously influenced by what others think and feel. And, it's a brave individual that is willing to go against the mob, which is actually why I wrote a song called Milgram's 37, because in the classic psychological controversial test, when a group of volunteers were asked to inflict pain on a group they thought were students, only 37% in that first experiment were willing to refuse to go to the sort of XXX high pain position button on this effectively torture machine.
Yeah, which is, and did you find that music or any of the other music that you've done with Milgram's 37, did that encourage people to help talk about the issues, or do you think there's a role for music to play in depolarization and helping resolve difference?
I do on a number of levels, actually. I don't, as a young man in the 60s, I probably would have thought, all the Beatles have just led this revolution. Young people are taking power for the first time. It's going to transform everything. Of course, that didn't happen. But there are some advantages. Musicians plug into the emotional. I always think a music collection is a bit like a cupboard full of pills. You have ways to control your mood through what you choose to play. And although, we're never going to get to the depth of an issue that a writer would, might get, I think we have a role, with film, art, music in questioning and introducing ideas.
And have you, and I suppose I just want to build on that because you run WOMAD, which is World of Music, Arts and Drama, and the festival there. And that's brought together a lot of people over the years and exposed people to different things. And have you found that leads to sustained connections or maybe people even changing their own minds? Have you ever tested that or been curious to find that out about attendees? Yeah,
well, I think, I came from a comfortable middle-class home, which you know all too well. And it's... so to be opened up to the world was a process and not always comfortable. But, I'm so grateful. And, I think part of what WOMAD celebrates is music's ability to get under the sheets and touch people in ways that other things don't, maybe. But it also also is there to show the stupidity of racism, because I found that people with whom I couldn't communicate, who came from different cultures, different religions, different languages, once we started making noises together, we could start laughing and smiling and feeling the emotion of what each other was doing. And, you can do that with words and with food and images, but it's somehow more directly plugged into the emotional system without going through a lot of the mental filters that language has. It is a type of language, music, but it's a more emotional and direct version.
And do you make any attempts with WOMAD, and I just don't know the answer, maybe I should, to reach out to people who maybe might find that kind of interaction most difficult? And I suppose, and it's a sweeping generalization, but people who maybe are hostile to immigration or and groups like that, who suddenly then have hopefully a much more positive experience where they've shared things and that's been brokered. Do you do any of that work?
Well, half price for racists.
But I don't. Well, actually, just because you're having,
but actually, no,
That's brilliant.
The point.
Yeah, come on, start the WOMAD half price for racists.
Yeah, that's right. But in a way, it's we don't really, other than I think some of the work that the foundation does, which is not a huge entity, as you also know, but in other words, taking some of these musicians from other countries into schools is a great thing for kids, because I think a lot of this stuff does begin in childhood. You've just been reading this book by this guy Hinton. I can't remember his first name, but who was on death row and for a crime that he didn't commit. But he got friendly, black, and he got friendly with this Ku Klux Klan guy who was also there for murder. And that is what gives me hope. When people break through the stereotypes, our ability to judge is the thing that scares me. That if we can put the judgments down and find ways to explore each other's humanity, then I think there's room for hope.
So can I just challenge you to put maybe one of your judgments down? I know you were slightly joking,
Right.
but you kind of said half price for racists.
Yeah.
And actually, just because somebody is slightly struggling with immigration or reconciling how their life will fit with people who might be from another race coming in, I don't think that inherently means that they hate them. It just means that they're finding it a bit difficult. And that's perfectly understandable and okay, isn't it?
Yeah. And my dad, who was a hero to me in so many ways, and very progressive and liberal-minded in lots of areas, as in his late 90s, wasn't comfortable with nurses of a different color. And that would be, with humanity, you have to work with what is. A lot of it's very natural. I don't see myself as that much more evolved. I know I will still have judgments and prejudices that have been fed into me, or that I have to work hard to break through.
Are there any that you're currently working on at the minute?
I've got a thing with nieces that
you
I'm working on right now.
You love them just a bit too much.
Well, not in the sort of no.
Let's not go there on the podcast.
I was going to make a very inappropriate remark, but that's a family weakness. Inappropriate remarks.
It will be a short dive from there to farting. I can tell you right now.
Anyway, yeah.
Laura, welcome to our family.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. It's
Great.
But is there anything that that you'd like, you wish you could be a bit more open-minded on that you're not?
one of the things which partly from talking to your mum, but I'm trying to work out on schools, religious schools, for example, and it seems to me things in society are either designed to bring us more together or to separate us more. And I think I'm against things that separate us more. So I think I'm coming to the conclusion, having thought, it's this whole multicultural debate that people should have their rights to be who they want to be and follow their own beliefs, which I would still support, but it cannot be at the cost of separating people too much and feeding division. But that's such an awkward bugger to get right. Where is that line, and how do you? I don't know the answers to these questions. One of the ideas that I thought would be interesting to talk about is whether now we know in sort of subatomic physics that it's possible for a particle to be in two places at one time. Whether we're moving to an age where you can be in two ideology places at one time. Can I be, are we potentially hypocrites and of multiple? Are we multiple personae in this new world? And if that's an idea that it carries some water, then how do we respond to that? And do we have to say on this line of whatever it is, people are being left and right, or in political terms or whatever, that actually you've got one particular point along that line, or could you be in two different points? And so there is that view of polarization. Is it just the one position of the pole, or can you be on the North Pole and the South Pole simultaneously?
Yeah, so people do hold conflicting views. So let me give you an example. So in local politics, we see people all the time in favour of more affordable housing in the general area. But as soon as it comes to their own backyard, they don't want any housing on their fields, in their back gardens to be built on. But, and this is the key thing, we really don't like this inconsistency. We really, really prefer, we're really, really motivated to be consistent in our thoughts and actions. So there's this famous psychologist called Leon Festinger who developed a theory called cognitive dissonance to describe this mental stress and this discomfort that we feel when we hold two conflicting thoughts. And typically what you see is people going out of their way to reduce this dissonance or inconsistency by changing their behaviour or their beliefs so it's consistent. So they can do this by I just said that. So you can change your behaviour so it's much more consistent with your thoughts. You can avoid or reject information that doesn't fit with one of your beliefs, or just by rationalising or justifying your position. So again, thinking back to our housing example, people might start rationalising why it's not actually the right thing to build in their backyards for seemingly very good reasons. The badgers, or it's the rabbits or the bees, and they've never actually cared about those things, but it helps them to align and to make their views and beliefs much more consistent. So yes, people can hold and often do hold multiple conflicting positions, but on the whole we're generally motivated to find ways to appear and feel as consistent as possible.
Laura, I'm conscious that you might have a question or two that you want to chip in.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. Pete, I was just going to ask, is there one standout issue for you that you have either changed your mind on quite fundamentally or wanted to but been unable to?
I mean, when Ali first mentioned this, I was trying to think, and obviously I knew that I was right 100% of the time on everything. So
of course.
So I thought, how can this apply to me? No, but I think, my positions have changed often. Dickie's laughing at me now. But I have a slightly different persona when I'm touring, but that's another story. Anyway, but animal intelligence was one thing, where I thought it was limited. And then actually when I spent time with apes, that was something that blew me away, just was painfully obvious. You'd have to be, in my opinion, deaf, dumb, and blind not to recognize intelligence once you start working with, these were language-able bonobo apes, but there are, I think, with dolphins, elephants. It sounds like old hippie stuff, which it is in part, but actually there's a very hard issue because we are destroying most of the natural environment. We only have for one planet, all these cliches, but we share it with other species. And when you learn how many stars there are out there, there's absolute certainty that there have to be other intelligent life forms somewhere out there. So one day we're going to come across them, unless we remove ourselves from the world of the living beforehand, which is perfectly possible. And at that moment, it would be very helpful if we'd had some experience in trying to communicate with intelligent species already on our planet before we destroy them all.
Absolutely. That's a very serious note, but I feel like I would be doing the listeners a disservice if I didn't ask you about your on-tour personality. How is it different?
Oh, my on-tour personality, I can be an awkward bastard. And Dickie, as my engineer, when things are going wrong or something's really pissing me off during a performance, he will get the rough end of it. Would you agree with that, Dickie?
Yeah, that's part of what happens.
As part of what happens. He's saying it very diplomatically. When you're performing and it's a complex operation, things have to be dealt with urgently and with intent.
Pete, on that note, I think we need to bring this to a close.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's been lovely to have you here and being so
Actually,
candid.
I do want to mention one other thing while we're still going.
Oh, gosh.
No, we
What's
were
coming?
talking about it upstairs. No, it was related with
please
trust.
do. I'll be more polite than your.
This is I think, called revenge, maybe.
No, not at all. It's not. Well, firstly, the inner world, which is getting stormier, the old trees get knocked over by hurricanes. The young, flexible ones don't. So how do we retain youthfulness and flexibility in our mental state as well as our physical state? That's one question. And the other was about democracies, which we sort of touched on. But if it is true that we're getting much easier to manipulate, can we trust democracy any longer?
Well, the second question I think might be slightly easier to answer than the first. The way to frame that might be actually, can we trust democracy as it's regulated at the minute? Because actually, there's quite a lot of integrity in a lot of the UK electoral process on the whole. It's very unusual for ballot papers to go missing that kind of stuff.
I think you're misunderstanding me.
Do you mean the role of social media, particularly in democracy, or outside influence? Or
yeah, I meant, can we trust ourselves any longer? And are we better off? I don't know, with finding some people that we think are better than us and trusting them which is sort of our electoral system.
Kind of what an MP is, though, in theory.
Well, in a way, yeah, but other ways, but we don't get involved in the selection. I mean, I know in some parties you're supposed to be able to get involved in the selection of MPs, maybe, but somehow it always felt too far. But it's just. I guess, and I'm not putting it on a them. I'm saying, can I be trusted to make the right decision on things that are going to affect the future for my children when I know I'm being wound up
So one of our earlier guests, a woman called Deborah Mattinson, who specialises in, strategy and insult and polling, was talking about the role that citizens' juries could play in that. And I suppose my and the role that increased deliberation and education and thoughtful exposure to facts and experience can change how people make decisions. And I suppose my initial take would be the way, if there's a problem with trusting people or politicians being in touch with the electorate, is not to widen that gap, and it is to try and reduce it and to involve more people in what's happening. So a citizens' jury, in effect, is where you delegate a bit of a decision down to a representative group of people who will study what's going on and be presented with facts, often with guidance, and then make a decision. So in our law courts, that's exactly what juries do all of the time. And her suggestion, with which I personally have a great deal of sympathy, is to try and do more of that, and for people to get more relaxed about giving up power rather than centralising it. And so people feel like they've got more of a stake in their societies. It's really very hard to do well, and for people who are already quite distant from the electoral process to be brought into it, or who have lost faith in it. But that, I suppose, would be, yes, democracy is definitely in a crisis, particularly Western liberal democracies, but that feels like a better way to go to try and solve it, rather than to give people less of a say.
Well, I agree. I like the jury system. I think it's a really important element, less easy to manipulate. However, it's probably the 3 E's that need better bearing, which, as you described, really, education, evidence, and experience, because things that can get you further down any of those lines will, I think, make you a better decision maker.
Yeah, there's definitely quite a lot in that. Pete, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great.
It was lovely to talk to you about
lovely
this
to
stuff.
talk to
Very,
you.
very different.
No,
Laura,
it was brilliant. Thanks so much.
Great.
Thank you. You've given us so much. Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
I've enjoyed the
And
insight into your family as well, Ali.
Yeah, well, you haven't seen any of it yet.
Thank you, listeners, for joining us. We hope you enjoyed and are challenged by that as much as we were. Next week, we're going to be joined by a leading voice in the business community who talks about how the people he works with changed his mind on a big constitutional issue. We'd like to thank our producer, Caroline Crampton, Pete's soundman, Dickie Chappell, Open Democracy, who helped share the show with their many readers, and Kevin MacLeod, whose Dreams Become Real is used in Creative Commons as our music.